Welcome to today's deep dive. Where we're going to kind of like unpack this whole complex thing about addiction in America. We've got some really cool academic and historical stuff for you guys. And by the end of this, I think you'll have a much better idea of how addiction like even gets defined and how like society and the legal side of it has evolved in the U.S.
Oh yeah, it's
Everything-
definitely a trip through time and like science even and how people see it.
Right. So one of the sources we have, the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, they define addiction as like a primary chronic neurobiological disease.
hmm
Uh, what does that even mean for someone who's dealing with addiction? It sounds kind of serious.
It is. The big thing here is we're moving away from the idea that addiction is like a moral failing, right? We're
Yeah.
starting to understand it's a disease and that changes everything about how we treat it and try to stop it.
So it's not about willpower. We're just making different choices.
Exactly. We got to recognize that there's stuff going on inside, biologically, influenced by your genes and the environment.
Okay, so it's a disease, but what's that actually look like in someone's life? The definition also talks about like losing control over drug use, using compulsively, continuing even when it's hurting you, and intense cravings.
Those are like the red flags, the signs that addiction's taken root.
Yeah.
And this isn't just some theory. This definition has real consequences for people, for families, for whole communities.
Yeah, it affects how we make laws, how we treat people, how we even see people who are struggling with it.
Absolutely. Now, we also got this newer definition from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, ASAM. They say addiction is like a treatable chronic medical disease. It involves these complex interactions between brain circuits, your genes, environment, and what you've been through in life.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot to digest. It really shows just how complicated addiction is.
It does. It's showing how so many things are at play here. Your brain chemistry, your DNA, your surroundings, and even the things you've experienced all play a part in addiction developing.
And they go on to say people with addiction do stuff that becomes compulsive and often keep doing it even when it's bad for them. That really shows how powerful addiction can be.
Yeah, this idea of doing stuff even when it hurts you is super important for understanding why just telling someone to quit doesn't usually work. ASAM says that treating addiction has similar success rates to treating other long-term diseases, so people need ongoing care and support.
That's important, gives people hope that it can be treated.
Totally. Now, to get the whole picture of how addiction impacts us, we need to look back at its history in America.
Okay, let's do some time traveling. We could start with the Civil War, where they used morphine a lot for pain.
Yeah.
Sadly, tons of people got addicted even after the war ended. It's kind of crazy that people got hooked on this super addictive drug through medical use.
It is. And while that was happening, the whole prohibition movement was getting bigger, which really shaped how people saw drug use for a long time.
Right. And then we hit the late 1800s, and cocaine explodes onto the scene. Used it in medicine, cigarettes, even soda. You can imagine that.
It's hard to believe now. Back then, people thought cocaine was just this harmless little boost.
Yeah, but as you can guess, cocaine addiction spread like wildfire, and Oregon was the first state to ban it in 1887. But that didn't stop people in the rest of the country, did it?
No, of course not. And this is where things get really interesting. Bayer, the company, they started selling heroin. They said it was this non-addictive alternative to morphine.
Wait, seriously? Heroin is a safe option. How did they mess that up so badly?
It just shows how much we've learned about addiction since then. Something that seems fine at the time can turn out to have terrible consequences.
That's a wild piece of history. By the early 1900s, cocaine was being linked to crime in cities. And in the South, you see this messed up thing where white employers were forcing black workers to use cocaine so they'd work more.
Huh.
Obviously, that caused widespread addiction.
Yeah, this shows how race and economics have always been tied up with drugs and addiction in America. It's not just a neutral thing. It's deeply connected to who has power and social inequalities.
So while cocaine's becoming a huge problem, the 18th Amendment gets ratified in 1919. That's the one that banned alcohol in the U.S. It's interesting how alcohol and drug prohibition got so connected in that era.
It is. And then in 1920, the Dangerous Drug Act made cocaine illegal to use or possess. Then they did the same thing for heroin in 1924. The government really wanted to control what people were using, but prohibition didn't actually stop people.
Right, and all the illegal stuff kept going through the 1920s. But then in 1933, the 21st Amendment got rid of the 18th, so alcohol was legal again. What happened then? Did the government just give up on controlling drugs?
Not really. Now they focused even harder on banning drugs. People saw how reckless everyone was with alcohol in the 20s, and that scared them, so anti-drug people got even more determined.
So how did the government react?
They made these drug tax acts, which basically put huge taxes on marijuana and other recreational drugs to stop people from using them, especially young people.
So the crackdown continued. And this leads us to a big moment in U.S. history. President Nixon's war on drugs in 1971. We'll dive into that next time.
Yeah, stay tuned. We're going to explore the whole war on drugs, what happened because of it, and the debate about how to handle addiction in America that's still going on today. Welcome back. Last time we were talking about how the government was trying to control drug use with taxes and stuff, right? Well, that kind of set the stage for this big turning point in America. President Nixon's war on drugs back in 1971.
And Nixon, really went for it, didn't he? He started Operation Intercept in '69 to, stop drugs coming from Mexico. Then in 1970, Congress passes the Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. That just made the government's position against drugs even stronger.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So those were huge moves in the whole war on drugs thing. And then just a couple of years later in 73, they created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. They had a big job just to enforce all these federal drug laws and fight drug trafficking here and in other countries.
So the war on drugs is in full swing now. But it doesn't stop there, right? It gets even bigger with Reagan in the 80s. Remember that Just Say No campaign? It was everywhere.
Yeah, the Just Say No campaign was huge. You saw it on TV, in schools, on billboards. It really showed how people thought back then. Drugs are bad, and if you just say no, you'll be fine.
But didn't people say that Just Say No oversimplified things? Addiction isn't just about willpower, is it?
You're right. The campaign was trying to do good, but it didn't deal with the real problems that make people use drugs, the social and economic stuff. And it definitely didn't see addiction as a disease that needs treatment.
It seems like they were more focused on punishing people than actually trying to understand the problem.
Yeah, and the Reagan administration also passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in '86. That made the punishments for drug crimes way harsher and gave a ton more money to law enforcement.
Sounds like they were really stepping up the war on drugs.
They were. And while the goal was to stop drug use and punish people selling drugs, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act had some consequences they didn't expect.
Like what? What happened?
Well, one thing was way more people ended up in prison, especially Black and Latino people. The law wasn't supposed to be discriminatory, but the way they used it really hurt those communities more than others.
It's like how policies that seem neutral can actually affect different groups in totally different ways. The war on drugs, even though it was supposed to help, just made the unfairness in the justice system even worse.
Exactly. And on top of the racial disparities, the war on drugs, with all its focus on police and punishment, messed up the whole criminal justice system. Prisons got super crowded, they didn't have enough resources, and tons of people who got caught up in the system just ended up stuck in poverty and doing the same stuff over and over.
So the war on drugs wanted to reduce drug use and crime, but it seems like it caused a bunch of new problems too.
That's the sad truth. When you make policies, sometimes there are unexpected consequences. It's really important to look at those consequences and change our approach.
So where does that leave us today? We've talked about how the idea of addiction has changed, from a moral failing to this complicated disease, how the war on drugs shaped our response, and all the historical events that affected drug use in America. It's a lot to think about.
It is, but we're not done talking about it. We still got to deal with what those policies did and figure out the best way to handle addiction going forward.
That's a perfect way to move into the last part of our deep dive. We're going to look at where things stand now, what we've learned, and the questions we still haven't answered. We've been through a lot in this deep dive, haven't we? From the Civil War all the way to the war on drugs. We've seen how people thought about addiction, treated it, and how society and politics played a role. So where do we go from here? What have we learned, and how should we deal with addiction now as a society?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? It's pretty clear that just saying no and focusing on punishing people hasn't really worked. In fact, as we talked about, it actually caused some problems, especially for communities that were already struggling.
So we can't just arrest our way out of this, can we? If those ways didn't work, what else can we do?
The research is pretty clear on this one. Addiction is a complicated disease, and we need to tackle it from all sides. It's not about willpower. It's about understanding what's going on in people's brains and minds and lives. The biological, psychological, and social stuff.
So what does that look like in real life? What kind of approach are we talking about?
Instead of just punishing people, we need to focus on preventing addiction, treating it, and reducing the harm it causes. We got to put money into research to find better therapies, and we need to create an environment where people feel supported and understood, not judged.
That makes sense. We've seen throughout history how stigma and shame just make things worse. People hide, and they don't ask for help.
Exactly. Education is huge, too. We need to change how people think about addiction and help them see it as a disease, not like a personal failing.
What about drug policy? Should we try different things like decriminalization or even legalization, but with good public health programs? Those are kind of controversial topics, aren't they?
They are, and they're tough questions with no easy answers. But it's something we need to talk about. What we're doing now isn't working for everyone. We have to look at new ways of doing things that put people's health and well-being first. Some countries have done this successfully, so we should see what's worked for them.
I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that addiction is a human problem.
Yeah,
It affects all of us in some way. We need to approach it with empathy, understanding, and a willingness to learn and change.
I agree 100%. We need to stop judging and start using facts to guide our decisions about prevention, treatment, and recovery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into addiction in America, I think we're left with some tough questions. How can we as individuals and as a whole society create a better environment for people dealing with addiction? How can we push for policies that make people healthier and reduce harm? Things to think about.
Absolutely. Addiction in America has a long and complicated history. We've made mistakes along the way, but we've learned a lot too. By understanding our history, we can make better choices now and create a more fair and compassionate future for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a new way of thinking about addiction and got some important conversations started. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep talking about this stuff.